Good afternoon. I'm Steve Nicholson, Senior Grains and Oilseed Analyst with Finance and Rabobank here in the United States. And I'm in St. Louis, Missouri. I'm so sorry that I won't be able to be with you live in both, whether virtually or in person. I wish I could come to Australia and see you, but hopefully I will get to Australia in the next year or so and we can sit down and break some bread together. But good afternoon and thank you for inviting me. As Nick has probably told you, I spoke to the International Oilseed Producers Dialogue back in the end of June, and this is a bit of a repeat performance. So I want to go over some of the highlights of this for you. And if you want to, at some point later time, come back together and have a further discussion, I'm more than open to do that. So let's just jump right in and let me talk a little bit about some of the topics we talked about with the IOPD. And I'm going to put a couple other things because there's been some changes since then. So first of all, let's talk about the question, is this a lot of headlines about commodity boom? Is this a cyclical or structural move in the market? Also, the big thing when we think about oilseeds right now is low carbon fuel standards and renewable diesel. Spend a little time on that. When I talked to the IOPD, one of the discussions is they wanted me to talk a little bit about both acreage needs in the future. And we'll talk about that. And I think it's a really important discussion for those of us in Canada, the United States, and Australia. There's also discussion questions from the group wanting to talk about farmland values and outlook for U.S. crop margins. So I'll talk a little bit about that, and we'll weave Australia and Canada into that as well. So let's jump right into is this a cyclical change? Is this just a part of the cycle? Is this a structural change? I will tell you up front, my view is this is not a structural change. This is purely just a blip in the cycle if you have it. And you're seeing a slide that will show U.S. average corn price from 1900 until today. And if you look at that slide, you can see clearly where prices moved and why. You can see the time World War II where they moved up to a new kind of $1 to $2 a bushel. And then we saw the Great Russian grain robbery of the early 1970s, corn prices moved into that $2 to $3 range. And then you see the mid-aughts, the mid-2000s, when we moved with ethanol and the global demand boom, we moved from corn prices now kind of $3.50 to $7 to $8. And we're still in that price range today. So because we are, that's to me is an indication that we are still in the same cycle we before. We're not in a commodity boom or a super cycle. We're just in the same cycle we've always been. So I do want to show you a couple demand slides. First, I'm going to show you the corn demand slide. And you can see until 2006-07, that corn demand line was almost flat. Now, for those of you who remember your Economics 101, that slide the demand curve tends to slope is a negative slope. This is a flat slope, so it means that as price varies, the demand moves up and down, not a big deal. But as we go to 07, 08, we see that demand curve shift a little bit more, and it shifts more to that negative view. So as price goes up, you see demand pull back more, and you see more price volatility. If you look at the projections for this year and for next year, and I've pointed them out on the slide, they're still within the range of where we've been before. The interesting thing is we see higher prices, but we don't see much decrease in the demand side. We have not seen that yet, and the projections so far are not showing that. So that's a bit of a shift in how markets behave, but it hasn't really changed what I would say structural demand yet in that. I'm also going to show soybeans here, and it's a very similar slide that you saw with corn, but the fact is you see the projections a little bit farther out, and you wonder, and I have to tell you, that's the one question, and the one thing I'm watching very carefully, are we seeing the demand curve for soybeans move out? And so that's something to be paying attention to. I will say one other thing that's interesting, when you look at the demand curve for soybean oil, and this is the US market, so I keep that in mind, but I would think that this is also true for palm oil, and probably not unlike for canola as well, is that demand curve is positive. It is going up like a supply curve. And I don't want to get too deep in the weeds, but in talking to colleagues about that phenomenon, it's like the demand curve for soybean oil is just little demand curves that continue to move up and to the right, meaning that as prices go up and even demand goes up because it's a food product and it's needed. And we'll talk a little more in depth about what's happening with that vegetable oil market because it's important to what happens in the canola market. So I want to kind of transition now into renewable diesel. And in Europe, they call it HVO, but it's all the same thing. And in the United States here, the primary drivers that has been California, their low carbon fuel standard. We now have Washington and Oregon have also low carbon fuel standards. We have 5 other states, Colorado, Minnesota, South Dakota, Iowa, and New York are also debating low carbon fuel standards. British Columbia and Canada has a low carbon fuel standard, and Canada is debating at the federal level. But when you look at this chart and you look at what this is, we're in the midst of a huge buildup in renewable diesel here in the United States. And it's coming to levels that when you look at it, and we'll start to dig a little deeper into this, look unsustainable. We don't have enough feedstock to meet these needs, or the needs of feedstock for these renewable diesel facilities coming online. By 2024, we won't be at our max, but we're going to be very, very close to where we're doing. So, and on this chart, you see exactly what I'm talking about. So let me describe this chart because I know it's a little busy, so I apologize for that. So the yellow bar is total vegetable oil supply minus food use. So I'm taking that food use out, which is about 58.5% of total supply of all vegetable oils in the United States is used for food. So that gold bar gives you, okay, here's what's left in the sense of here's what we can use for other uses. The green bar is biodiesel plus estimated renewable diesel demand. You can see how that moves up as we get here into 21, 22, 23 and beyond, matches very closely, not surprisingly, with the ramp up in renewable diesel production. And then the blue bar gives you that supply deficit. And you can see it's blue and red, and you can see that red bar. So we're getting to the point now when you get on these out years, you're down your deficit of close to 25 to 30 billion pounds of vegetable oils in the United States. Now, just for reference, we're only producing about 25 billion pounds in the United States of soybean oil right now. And that's by far the biggest vegetable oil. So we don't have enough of other vegetable oils to make up that deficit. And you can see the deficit is just continues to get worse. So you can see just the magnitude of this problem that we're facing right now in the vegetable oil market in the United States and literally globally. And I will tell you, when we talk about this on a global basis, we cannot make the global balance sheets work for vegetable oils because there's too much demand and not enough supply or not enough feedstock. Now, this is where it gets a little more interesting. When we look at the carbon intensities of specific vegetable oils, what California's done is gone for the low-hanging fruit. Tallow, distiller's corn oil, which comes out of the ethanol business, and then used cooking oil are very low carbon intensities. And you think, and they have taken the majority of that supply is going into the California market for low carbon fuel standard. The other one that has an extremely low carbon intensity is canola oil. And as you well know, canola oil also has very high oil content. So it becomes the next target in the sense of that's where the next feedstock needs to come from. Soybean oil does not have a low carbon intensity at the current time because of indirect land use charges. I can tell you in having chats and discussions with folks in the United States, that is being looked at because we're not tearing down rainforests, we're not tearing down pastures, we're not expanding land for soybeans unless it's coming from other croplands. So this is being looked at again, and we may need to have different situations for soybean oil depending on what country it's coming from. So this is really important to understand these carbon intensities and why canola oil is really in the sights right now if you want to have it. So if you look at this and remember that deficit, and we look at the amount of acres needed to supply that deficit, in soybeans that comes up to 50 to almost 60 million acres. We're only planting 88 million acres in the United States now. So you're having a huge increase in acres, and those acres are going to come from some other crop, and we don't have the acres. We have a huge acreage constraint, and I'll come back to that in a minute. If you look at canola, again, it's a less acreage because it's a higher content oil, and it's only needing about 35 to 40 million acres. Now, keep in mind when we think about, in the United States, we're only planting 2 or 3 million acres of canola. In Canada, we're planting 22 million acres. So you can see that's more than a doubling of canola acres across the North American landscape. And that's likely not going to happen. How do we find those acres? You take them from other crops. And when we look in the middle of the country, in Canada, in the United States, that means it comes from it comes from potentially wheat. And I can tell you flour millers are already concerned about this. Potentially comes from sorghum. and soybeans and corn may also lose some acres if we plant to meet these needs. And I think if is the big question there. How does this all reconcile? How do we figure this out? And I think that's the real challenge right now. So if we think about that from an acreage point of view, there's other things also happening that are creating other issues around. We do see in Canada, as you well know, there are 5.7 million metric tons of crush coming on capacity in the next 3 years. So that's going to require about 3 million more hectares of additional acres. So probably coming out of wheat. Probably wheat and barley are the two crops where that's going to come from. It's going to be, again, how do we do that and what happens? Flour millers still need wheat. For flour milling, we still need that high protein wheat that Canada produces because of low protein wheat in the world. It is a huge challenge that we are facing right now in the oilseed market. And it comes down, when is this all going to, and we need to will be a day of reckoning to figure out, do we build the renewable diesel plants? Do we meet the environmental needs of reducing carbon emissions or greenhouse gases, and at the same time feeding people? So you have a huge debate coming on of food, fuel, and the environment. And in some ways you have both an environment, you have a discussion with the environmental community about we want lower carbon, but we don't want to expand crop acres and more intensive crop acres. So there is a lot of discussion yet to happen. And I will tell you, as we have delved into this issue, everything that we determine or we find and say, oh, I understand that, I have 10 more questions. So this is an ongoing issue this is an issue that was not going to be solved anytime soon. I will tell you, just as an aside, and not an aside, but just to expand and kind of wrap up this particular section about acres and area, is that when you think about as I said, I talked about the United States and Canada there are restrictions on how much canola can expand because they don't have new acres, and also just the need for rotation. And in talking to my colleague, Cheryl Kalish-Gordon in Australia, we see the same issue in Australia. You don't have the acres or the area to expand because you need that for rotational purposes. To break those cycles of disease, insects, weeds. You can't just go continuous canola across Canada, across Australia. It's not going to be the case. Now, having said that, it is a brighter picture for Australia from a standpoint of canola. When we look at Canada's situation, and you say they're going to increase that crush 57% or 5.7 million metric tons, the good news is that's all probably going to be absorbed here domestically in North America. That's going to, in a sense, be a 1-for-1 reduction in exports. That'll be good for Australian exports of canola into the Asian market, where much of the Canadian canola goes. So you can see there are some good news for Australia and for the Australian canola producer and the oilseed market there. But the reality is we still aren't going to have enough to meet everyone's needs for food and also for renewable diesel or biofuels globally. And this is the huge challenge that the oilseed market is facing, and expect that prices will continue to stay very elevated for at least the next 2 or 3 years until we have that reckoning as how is this going to work. Now we're going to move a little bit and tangential talk about acres. Let's talk about margins, because that's really important as well. And one of the questions that was asked to me when we started this process, when we started this dialogue with the IOPD, when we look at and thinking about what's happening in the oilseed markets and renewable diesel, we see that being reflected, as we see with corn prices and wheat prices. We're seeing that reflected in farmland values. If you have questions, and Wes Lefroy, who is my colleague in Australia, has done a terrific amount of good research, excellent research on farmland values in Australia. And my understanding is that they have had nice appreciation over the last several years due to good crop prices. And so that's what we're seeing here. We're seeing crop prices up, we're seeing revenue up, and that is translating directly into farmland values. Now, I look at my home state of Iowa, look at farmland values from Iowa State. We have a long history of that data. We take an annual survey, and we're seeing rates have been relatively flat for the last 7 years. But since the move in commodity pricing since August, we've seen prices start to move up as much as 7 to 8%. And more than likely, as we get into the survey time this fall, we will see prices move back up into the levels they were at their peak back in 2013, which was around $9,000 an acre. So you can see this has had a huge impact. It's also had a huge impact on cash rents and farm leases. We've seen prices for farm leases back in these, the depressed commodity area was in that $225 to $275 area. We've seen cash rents that have been renegotiated this year, upwards of $350 to $400 an acre. So a huge increase, and we expect that to continue going forward. So land values, we have a lot of appreciation for those. We think they will continue to appreciate, and we do think that the values of commodities and land will be well supported over the next couple, 3 years. One of the other things that they've asked me to talk about a little bit about margins. We have certainly seen a change in the margins over the last several years, and we will show a slide or two here about what margins are doing. And on this slide, there's a lot of things happening, but the bars represent the dollars per acre that it costs to produce these three, corn following corn, a corn soybean rotation, and corn following soybean. So looking at both sides of that. And you can see over the last several years, those margins have been very good. But if you start to look at last year, we started to see improvement, and you look at this year, we saw improvement, and then we start to see a little bit of downgrade or squeeze in those margins as we go into 2022. Primarily that's happening because the input costs tend to follow commodity prices higher. Land prices being one of the highest costs to the business, but also seed costs are a huge cost to business. And we do expect to see seed costs up 10 to 15% next year, but we've also seen an increase in fertilizer prices. Part of that is COVID related, as plants shut down or workers labor problem, also freight costs, and just the disruption of the supply chain. So we expect that 2022 will see lower margins, still positive margins, but a squeeze on margins going forward. So with that, I want to wrap up. I don't want to spend any more time. I've used enough of your time, and you've been gracious with that, and I thank you for that. I thank you for this opportunity to visit with you. I hope we get a chance to meet in person in the future. So long from the States, and I hope you have a good meeting. Thank you.